Cannibal Holocaust evokes the brutal policies of European colonialism from the perspective of the colonizers. The film depicts the continued exploitation of indigenous Americans by Western powers, represented by the American film crew and broadcasting network. Rather than being used for their labor or natural resources, as was the historical tradition, here the Amazonians are exploited for their images. According to Mark Goodall, Cannibal Holocaust poses the question, quote, "What is it to be civilized, and is it a good thing?" The film positions the perpetrators as inexplicable parts of their respective society, and in many cases as simply carrying out the social norms and ideologies of that society to their most extreme ends. The film crew render explicit the trauma that society permits be carried out on its behalf, but for which it refuses to take responsibility. A crucial aspect of Europe's colonial project was the process of othering the people and places that imperial states wanted to dominate and exploit. This involved depicting or describing groups of people as different and separate from Europeans in such a way that Western citizens perceive them as culturally regressive and genetically inferior. According to Edward Said, these racist and xenophobic characterizations, frequently found in European art and literature, were in turn used to justify the subjugation or destruction of the indigenous peoples of other continents. This collective dehumanization reflects the cultural construction of the monster, as well as the perpetrator's perception of their victim as someone lacking humanity and unworthy of sympathy. In Cannibal Holocaust, the indigenous Amazonian tribes are presented by the characters and the film itself as monstrous beings. For example, upon entering the jungle, Professor Monroe witnesses a Yakumo female being sexually assaulted and killed as ritual punishment for committing adultery. He is ordered by his guide not to intervene and can only look away in disgust while mournful, non-diegetic mood music plays, suggesting the horror of Yakumo culture. Another example of these monstrous characterizations is the fact that the characters refer to the Yakunomo, and Shamatari homeland as the Green Inferno. This name evokes Christian descriptions and European depictions of hell, linking the indigenous people to sinfulness and damnation, and implying that they must be saved. Furthermore, the very word cannibal immediately casts the tribespeople as wild and primitive in viewers' mind, in contrast with Western civility and rationality. Aaron Daniel Pearson argues that the word cannibal conjures up a catalogue of literary and cinematic villains who have plagued noble white protagonists for centuries, from English novels like Gulliver's Travels and The Time Machine to the more recent Italian Mondo documentaries such as Mondo Cane and African Addio, and horror films such as Man from Deep River, Last Cannibal World, and The Mountain of the Cannibal God. Viewers at the time of Cannibal Holocaust's release, and perhaps even today, were conditioned by art, literature, and cinema to associate cannibals with images of frenzied naked hordes tearing apart European bodies and devouring their flesh with wild abandon. However, for the majority of the film, this is not what Monroe finds. Certainly he is shown to be disturbed by the various acts of violence and the discovered remains of the journalists, but the only act of cannibalism he witnesses in person is part of a funeral ritual performed as a way for the Yanomamo to honor a deceased member of their tribe. Before we meet them, the tribespeople are referred to by various characters as being savage, Stone Age, and cruel, and yet upon encountering them, they do not attack Professor Monroe, but rather welcome him into their community and offer him vegetables and lodging. Likewise, the footage he discovers reveals that, upon encountering the film crew, the Yakumo villagers respond with a mixture of curiosity and shyness before cowering or fleeing in fear as the journalists begin threatening them with bullets and flames. The film does indeed end with the charging, bloodthirsty hordes that Western viewers had come to expect, but they manifest only as a result of the relentless assault by the Western journalists. Essentially, the indigenous Amazonians fulfill the role that the documentary and viewer has cast for them. This depiction affirms Said's contention that, over time, colonial violence and ideology will condition the subjugated people into adopting the dehumanized characterizations of their subjugators. Thus, Cannibal Holocaust simultaneously reflects upon colonialist stereotypes and reproduces them. The exploitation of Amazonians is justified by the film crew and the broadcasting executives on the benevolent basis that the cannibal tribes must be documented for anthropological purposes before they die out, as well as on the malevolent basis that they are a savage people unworthy of the dignity afforded to civilized people. Such rationalizations resemble the Orientalist arguments identified by Said, which ratified European expansions and conquests during the 17th and 18th centuries, including the colonization of Colombia, where Cannibal Holocaust is primarily set. That is, the characters in the film repeat colonial ideologies that the original inhabitants of these countries are stagnant and self-destructive, and therefore must be saved from themselves by the governing hand of a civilized power. This attitude stems directly from the colonial history of the region. For example, during Christopher Columbus's exploration of the Caribbean and the latter Spanish conquests of the Aztec Empire, there were widespread reports of cannibalism being practiced among locals. According to the anthropologist William Ahrens, these reports were cited throughout the Americas and in Spain as justification for a civilizing and pacifying mission to save the, quote, savages. In Spain, the monstrous or inhuman qualities associated with cannibalism were demonstrated by Queen Isabella's proclamation granting explorers and traders permission to enslave indigenous people who committed the act. However, as Ahrens argues, many of these reports of cannibalism were revealed to be, quote, steeped in racism, unsubstantiated, or based on second-hand or hearsay evidence. Likewise, the Western characters in Cannibal Holocaust demonstrate a vested interest in portraying the indigenous people as barbaric in order to justify their exploitation. Professor Monroe suggests a second reason for the film crew's behavior. When talking with the television executives, he directly argues that the sadism documented in the footage serves as both the means and the end goal of the filmmakers' project. That is, like the European invaders who preceded them, the filmmakers are terrorizing the indigenous Amazonians as a way of delivering commodities to Western markets. However, that commodity is not a tangible object or service, but rather the spectacle of horror itself. This is evidently true in the latter reels of the footage, which depict the filmmakers committing and documenting increasingly extreme acts of violence. Disturbingly, these acts are condoned by one television executive who claims that they are merely serving market demands and that, quote, the more we rape viewers' senses, the happier they are. Thus, Cannibal Holocaust offers a scornful postmodern reevaluation of the colonial project as little more than a machine for generating trauma, as well as a means for Western citizens to consume the suffering of foreigners independent of any of the goods or services their suffering was claimed to produce. However, as Césaire argues, by assaulting or rejecting the humanity of others, the perpetrator as individual and perpetrator as collective assaults and rejects their own humanity. This suggests a monstrous paradox, dramatized in the final gruesome sequence of Cannibal Holocaust, whereby the monster is created by society to fulfill the destructive needs and wants of society before eventually destroying society.